The crisp autumn morning in Riverside started like any other day at the local police department. Officer Richard Thompson adjusted his collar as he patrolled the quiet suburban streets, sipping coffee from his travel mug. After 15 years on the force, he had grown comfortable with his routines and position as a senior officer. Perhaps too comfortable. The department had been buzzing with news about their incoming police chief, but Thompson hadn't paid much attention to the details. The previous chief had retired after serving for 20 years, and the city council had conducted a nationwide search for his replacement. Thompson assumed it would be another traditional appointment, someone who'd maintain the status quo he'd grown accustomed to. As he turned onto Oak Street, he noticed a well-dressed black man examining a building that had recently experienced a break-in. The man was taking photos with his phone and making notes. Thompson's instincts, shaped by years of what he considered experience but what others might call bias, kicked in. He pulled his patrol car to the curb and stepped out, approaching with the authoritative stride he'd perfected over the years. "Sir, what exactly do you think you're doing here?" Thompson's tone carried an edge of condescension that had become habitual when dealing with certain members of the community. The man turned calmly, his tailored suit and professional demeanor seemingly at odds with Thompson's predetermined assumptions. "Good morning, officer," the man replied with unexpected poise. "I'm conducting a security assessment of the area." He reached for his pocket, but Thompson quickly raised his hand. "Keep your hands where I can see them," Thompson barked, his voice carrying across the quiet street. Several passers-by slowed their pace, watching the scene unfold. The man in the suit remained remarkably composed, his hands visible but his dignity intact. "Officer Thompson," he said, reading the nameplate on Thompson's uniform, "I understand your concern, but there's no need for that tone. I'm simply doing my job." Thompson scoffed, years of unchecked authority evident in his stance. "And what job would that be? This is a restricted area due to an ongoing investigation. I'm going to need to see some identification." The man's expression remained neutral, but his eyes carried a weight of experience with such situations. "Of course. However, I find it interesting that you immediately assumed I didn't belong here, despite my professional appearance and obvious documentation activities." "Sir, I don't need a lecture about assumptions." "I need your ID, now," Thompson demanded, his voice rising slightly. A small crowd had begun to gather at a respectful distance, some recording with their phones. The man slowly reached into his jacket pocket and produced not just an ID, but a badge that made Thompson's heart sink into his boots. "I'm David Washington, your new police chief. I started my preliminary work this morning, which included reviewing recent criminal activities in the area. I wanted to personally assess the break-in situation that's been affecting our local businesses." The silence that followed was deafening. Thompson's face flushed red as the realization of his behavior crashed over him. He had received a memo about the new chief starting his preliminary assessment today, but he hadn't bothered to read the attached biography or photo. Chief Washington continued, his voice level but firm. "Officer Thompson, I believe we need to have a discussion about community policing and professional conduct. My office, tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. The gathered crowd murmured, some shaking their heads, others nodding in approval of the chief's composed handling of the situation. Thompson stood frozen, his previous authority evaporating in the autumn breeze. "Yes, sir," Thompson managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "And Officer Thompson," Chief Washington added, "I expect all my officers to read their briefings thoroughly. The memo about my appointment included details about my plans to conduct personal field assessments. Had you read it, you might have approached this situation differently." As Thompson retreated to his patrol car, the weight of his actions pressed heavily on his shoulders. The chief's words echoed in his mind, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about his behavior and assumptions. The incident would soon become a talking point throughout the department, but more importantly, it would become a catalyst for change. Chief Washington watched the officer leave, then turned his attention back to his assessment. He had encountered similar situations throughout his 20-year career in law enforcement, rising through the ranks despite persistent prejudices. Now, as chief, he had the opportunity to address these systemic issues head-on, starting with Officer Thompson. The gathered crowd gradually dispersed, but the impact of the encounter lingered in the air. Some residents shared knowing looks, having experienced similar treatment themselves. Others seemed thoughtful, perhaps considering their own biases for the first time. As the morning wore on, news of the incident spread through the department like wildfire. Officers gathered in small groups, discussing the encounter in hushed tones. Some defended Thompson, citing his years of service, while others acknowledged that change was long overdue. In his patrol car, Thompson sat parked in a quiet corner of his beat, his coffee now cold and forgotten. The chief's composed response to his disrespectful behavior had shaken him more than any angry confrontation could have. For the first time in years, he began to question the patterns and prejudices that had become ingrained in his daily work. The autumn sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across riverside streets. This ordinary morning had become a turning point, not just for Officer Thompson, but for the entire department. Tomorrow's meeting would be just the beginning of a larger transformation, one that Chief Washington had carefully planned as part of his vision for the future of policing in Riverside. The next morning arrived with a weight of anticipation hanging over the Riverside Police Department. Officer Thompson arrived 30 minutes early for his meeting with Chief Washington, his usually confident stride replaced by careful, measured steps. The previous night had been sleepless, filled with replaying the incident and examining years of similar interactions he'd previously dismissed. As Thompson sat in the waiting area outside the chief's office, he noticed the walls had already been updated with new photographs. They showed Chief Washington's career progression, from his early days as a beat cop in Chicago to his successful tenure as deputy chief in Atlanta. Awards and commendations lined the walls, telling the story of a man who had earned every step of his journey through dedication and excellence. "Officer Thompson, the chief will see you now," the administrative assistant said, gesturing toward the door. Thompson stood, straightened his uniform, and entered the office with a mix of dread and resignation. Chief Washington sat behind his desk, reviewing a file that Thompson suspected was his own. The office had been transformed overnight, now featuring community outreach awards and family photos alongside the traditional law enforcement credentials. The chief looked up, his expression neutral but attentive. "Have a seat, officer," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "I've been reviewing your file. 15 years on the force, numerous commendations for bravery, above-average arrest record." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "And 17 civilian complaints about aggressive behavior and discriminatory conduct." Thompson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He'd always dismissed those complaints as part of the job, but seeing them laid out by his new chief cast them in a different light. "Sir, about yesterday," Thompson began, but Chief Washington raised his hand. "Before you continue, I want to show you something." He turned his computer monitor around, showing footage from one of the bystanders' phones from the previous day's encounter. Thompson watched himself on screen, seeing his behavior from an outside perspective for the first time. His dismissive tone, aggressive stance, and immediate assumptions played out in high definition. "This video has already been shared on social media," Chief Washington explained calmly. "It's gathered over 50,000 views overnight. The comments section is particularly enlightening." He turned the monitor back around. "But I'm not interested in public shame or punishment, Officer Thompson. I'm interested in growth and change." Thompson felt his throat tighten. "Chief, I never intended." "Intention isn't always the point," Chief Washington interjected. "Impact matters more. Yesterday, you didn't see a fellow law enforcement professional conducting an investigation. Your first instinct was to see a threat. I need to understand why." The chief's words cut through Thompson's defensive walls. For the first time, he considered how many other professionals, parents, or community members he might have treated similarly over the years. "I've always prided myself on being a good cop," Thompson said quietly. "I never thought of myself as prejudiced." "Few people do," Chief Washington replied. "But good policing isn't just about solving crimes or making arrests. It's about building trust, understanding the community we serve, and recognizing our own biases so we can work to overcome them." The chief stood and walked to the window overlooking the city. "I'm implementing new training programs for the entire department. Cultural competency, community engagement, implicit bias recognition, these aren't just buzzwords, they're essential tools for modern policing." Thompson nodded slowly, beginning to understand the magnitude of the change coming to Riverside PD. "You have a choice to make, Officer Thompson," Chief Washington continued. "You can resist these changes, cling to old habits, and eventually find yourself obsolete. Or you can be part of the transformation this department needs. Your experience could be valuable in helping other officers understand why these changes are necessary." The chief returned to his desk and pulled out a folder. "I'm assigning you to community outreach for the next month. You'll be working with Officer Chen in organizing neighborhood meetings, attending community events, and actually getting to know the people you've been policing. Consider it an opportunity for a fresh perspective." Thompson's initial instinct was to protest. Community outreach wasn't what he considered real police work. But something in the chief's steady gaze made him reconsider. "And Officer Thompson," the chief added, "I'll be watching your progress closely. This isn't punishment, it's an investment in your potential to be better." As Thompson left the office, the weight on his shoulders felt different. Instead of the burden of shame, he carried the responsibility of change. The station buzzed with activity, but he noticed details he'd overlooked before: the nervous glances from some civilian staff members when he passed, the subtle ways people of color changed their behavior in police presence. In the break room, he overheard two younger officers discussing the new chief's background, his doctorate in criminal justice, his successful implementation of community policing programs in other cities, and his reputation for transforming troubled departments. Thompson headed to his patrol car, his mind already processing the changes ahead. As he drove through his usual beat, he began to see the community through a different lens. The teenagers he usually viewed with suspicion were just kids walking home from school. The group of men he typically watched closely were local business owners having lunch. The autumn day had brought more than just a change in assignment, it had sparked the beginning of a personal revolution. As Thompson parked near a community center where Officer Chen was waiting to brief him on their upcoming outreach projects, he realized that his greatest challenge wouldn't be facing the community's skepticism, but confronting and changing his own deeply rooted perspectives. Officer Thompson's first week of community outreach began at the Pine Street Community Center, a worn but well-maintained building that served as the heart of Riverside's predominantly minority neighborhood. Officer Chen, a 10-year veteran known for her exceptional community relations, watched as Thompson awkwardly arranged chairs for their first neighborhood meeting. "Relax," Chen said, noting his stiff movements. "They're just people who want their neighborhood to be safe, just like everyone else." She'd been briefed about Thompson's situation and had volunteered to mentor him, seeing an opportunity for genuine change. The community center gradually filled with local residents, small business owners, teachers, parents, and even some teenagers. Thompson recognized several faces from his patrols, but for the first time, he was seeing them in a different context. The elderly woman he'd often seen at the bus stop was actually a retired school principal. The young man he'd frequently viewed with suspicion owned a successful local bakery. As Chen facilitated the meeting, Thompson sat quietly, listening to community members share their experiences and concerns. A middle-aged woman stood up, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke about her teenage son. "I have to teach my boy how to act around police," she said, her words cutting through the room. "Don't run, even if you're late for school. Keep your hands visible at all times. Don't wear your hood up, even in the rain. What kind of world is it where I have to fear for my child's safety around the very people meant to protect him? Thompson felt the weight of her words. He thought about his own son, how he'd never had to have such conversations with him. The reality of this disparity hit him harder than any sensitivity training session ever had. Another resident, an elderly man who owned the local hardware store, spoke about the recent break-in that Chief Washington had been investigating. "We need police presence here, but we need officers who see us as people to protect, not suspects to interrogate. We need to build trust, on both sides." As the meeting progressed, Thompson found himself taking notes, really listening to the community's perspectives. When a young teacher described being pulled over 3 times in 1 month for routine checks, Thompson recognized his own behavior in her story. He'd made similar stops countless times, always justifying them as good policing. During the break, Thompson walked to the refreshment table where the baker, whose name he learned was Robert, was arranging his donated pastries. "These look amazing," Thompson said awkwardly, trying to bridge the gap. Robert looked at him with surprise, then offered a small smile. "Try the cinnamon rolls. They're my grandmother's recipe." As Thompson took a bite, Robert added, "You know, I see you drive past my shop every day. First time you've ever stopped to talk." The simple observation carried years of unspoken history. Thompson nodded, acknowledging the truth in those words. "I'm learning that I've missed a lot by never stopping to talk." Later that evening, Chief Washington made an appearance at the meeting, his presence adding weight to the department's commitment to change. He moved through the room with natural ease, greeting people by name, asking about their families, demonstrating the kind of community policing he wanted to see. Thompson watched as the chief handled a heated moment when a young activist confronted him about the department's history of discriminatory practices. Instead of becoming defensive, Chief Washington listened, acknowledged the truth in the criticism, and outlined specific steps the department was taking to address these issues. "Change doesn't happen overnight," the chief told the group, "but it does happen through honest conversations like these, through acknowledging our mistakes, and through committed action to do better." After the meeting, as Thompson helped stack chairs, a teenage boy approached him. He recognized the youth as someone he'd stopped and questioned multiple times over the past year. "Officer Thompson," the boy said, his voice carrying a mix of caution and hope, "my basketball team practices here on Thursdays. We could use some more players, if you're interested." The invitation, though tentative, represented something profound, an opportunity to build bridges that Thompson had spent years unknowingly burning. That night, driving home in his personal car, Thompson took a detour through the neighborhood. He passed Robert's Bakery, now closed for the day but warm light still spilling from the back where preparation for the next day had already begun. He drove by the community center, where the basketball court lights illuminated young players perfecting their game. He saw these streets differently now, not as a territory to patrol, but as a community of people living their lives, raising their families, pursuing their dreams. At home, Thompson sat in his kitchen, still in uniform, staring at his reflection in his cold coffee. His wife noticed his unusually contemplative mood. "Rough day?" she asked, sitting beside him. "Educational," he replied after a moment. "I've been policing these streets for 15 years, but I think I'm just starting to see them for the first time." He pulled out his notebook from the meeting, filled with names, concerns, and insights he'd never bothered to collect before. His phone buzzed with a message from Officer Chen, "Good job today. Ready for tomorrow's youth center visit?" Thompson typed back, "Ready," surprised to find he actually meant it. The message was followed by another from Chief Washington, "Progress isn't about being perfect. It's about being better than yesterday. Keep going." As he prepared for bed, Thompson thought about the next day's assignment at the youth center. For the first time in his career, he wasn't thinking about authority, control, or enforcement. Instead, he was thinking about connections, understanding, and the long road to earning trust. The incident with Chief Washington had cracked open a door, but these community meetings were pushing it wide open, forcing Thompson to confront the reality of his impact on the very community he'd sworn to protect and serve. It wasn't comfortable, but then again, real change never was. The Riverside Youth Center buzzed with activity as Thompson walked through its doors the next morning. The walls were covered with vibrant artwork and college pennants, a stark contrast to the stark institutional settings he was used to. Officer Chen was already there, chatting easily with a group of teenagers who seemed surprisingly comfortable around her. "Perfect timing," Chen called out. "We're about to start the mentorship program discussion." She gestured to an empty chair in the circle where about 15 teenagers sat, some eyeing Thompson with clear skepticism. He recognized several faces from his past patrols, but this time, their usual wariness carried a weight he was only beginning to understand. A youth counselor named Anthony, who'd worked at the center for over a decade, started the session. "Today, we're talking about career paths and opportunities. Officer Chen has been a regular mentor here, and Officer Thompson is joining our program." Anthony's tone was welcoming but carried a subtle challenge: "Prove you deserve to be here." One of the teenagers, a bright-eyed girl wearing a debate team jacket, raised her hand. "Officer Thompson, aren't you the one from that viral video with Chief Washington?" The room grew quiet, all eyes turning to him. Thompson felt his face grow warm, but Chief Washington's words about growth echoed in his mind. "Yes, that was me," he admitted, straightening in his chair. "And I'm here because that incident made me realize I needed to change how I interact with our community. I'm here to learn, if you're willing to teach me." His honesty seemed to shift the atmosphere slightly. A young man named Tyler, whom Thompson had once stopped for simply running to catch a bus, spoke up. "Well, I've got some things you need to learn. Like why running while black shouldn't be considered suspicious activity." Instead of becoming defensive, as he might have just weeks ago, Thompson nodded. "You're right. I'd like to hear your perspective." What followed was 2 hours of the most eye-opening conversations of Thompson's career. The teenagers shared their experiences, dreams, and frustrations with a candor that stripped away his preconceptions. Tyler wanted to be an architect and had already won a scholarship to the state university. Another student was developing a community app to connect local businesses with youth looking for part-time work. During a break, Thompson found himself by the basketball court where several kids were shooting hoops. One of them, a tall boy named Chris, passed him the ball. "You play, officer?" Thompson caught the ball, memories of his own high school basketball days flooding back. "Used to. Might be a bit rusty now." "Show us what you got," Chris challenged, a hint of a smile playing at his lips. Thompson removed his jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and took the shot. It wasn't pretty, but it went in. The kids hooped and laughed, and suddenly the uniform didn't seem like such a barrier. As they played, Thompson learned that Chris's father had been incarcerated for a minor offense when Chris was young, fundamentally changing his family's trajectory. "One mistake, one biased officer," Chris said during a water break, "that's all it takes to change someone's whole life." The weight of those words hit Thompson hard. How many lives had he impacted with his own biased actions over the years? Later that afternoon, Chief Washington stopped by the center. He watched from the doorway as Thompson sat with a group of students, helping them with a project to design community safety workshops. The chief smiled slightly, noting the genuine engagement that had replaced Thompson's former rigid authority. "Officer Thompson," the chief called out. "A word?" Thompson joined him in the hallway, expecting criticism. Instead, the chief handed him a folder. "The community center meeting minutes from yesterday. Your notes were particularly insightful." Thompson blinked in surprise. "Sir? Progress isn't just about acknowledging mistakes, Thompson. It's about actively working to be part of the solution. I'm seeing that effort from you." Before leaving, Chief Washington added, "The department's quarterly review is coming up. I'd like you to present your experiences and insights to your fellow officers. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come from within our own ranks. As the day at the youth center wound down, Anthony approached Thompson. You know, when Chen told me you were joining us, I had my doubts. That video didn't exactly inspire confidence. He paused, watching as the teenagers cleaned up the basketball court. But something's different about you now. Thompson watched as Tyler helped a younger student with homework, as Chris organized the next day's mentorship schedules. I'm starting to see what I was blind to before, he replied. These aren't just statistics or potential problems to manage. These are kids with dreams, futures, potential. And my job isn't to control them, it's to help protect those dreams. Anthony nodded approvingly. That's the kind of thinking we need more of in uniform. He handed Thompson a schedule. We meet every Tuesday and Thursday. Plus, the basketball team could use an assistant coach. Interested? Thompson looked at the schedule, then at his watch. He was technically off duty in 10 minutes, but the old Thompson, who rushed home the moment his shift ended, seemed like a different person now. I've got time, he said, picking up a basketball. Who's up for another game? As he drove home that evening, Thompson's phone buzzed with a text from Tyler. Thanks for listening today, Officer T. Maybe you're not as bad as that video made you look. Thompson smiled, realizing that while the video had captured one of his worst moments, it had also become the catalyst for what might be his most important transformation. The sun was setting over Riverside as Thompson parked in his driveway, casting long shadows across the neighborhood. He sat in his car for a moment, reflecting on how much had changed in just a few short weeks. The badge on his chest felt different now, less like a symbol of authority and more like a commitment to the community he was finally learning to truly serve. The day of the quarterly department review arrived with a nervous energy permeating the Riverside Police Department. Thompson stood in the break room, adjusting his tie for the third time while reviewing his presentation notes. The past few weeks had transformed him in ways he never expected, and now he faced perhaps his greatest challenge, sharing those changes with his fellow officers. Officer Baker, a veteran cop known for his old-school approach, walked in. Heard you're drinking the Kool-Aid now, Thompson, he said, pouring his coffee. Community outreach, basketball with teenagers, what happened to real police work? Thompson looked up from his notes, meeting Baker's eyes. You know what I've learned, Baker? Real police work isn't just about arrests and citations. It's about preventing problems before they start. The break room fell silent as other officers listened in. Thompson continued, his voice steady. Remember that kid we used to hassle on Pine Street? Always wearing that red hoodie? He's got a full scholarship to study architecture. But he almost lost it when we stopped him that night, roughed him up a bit because he fit a description. That could have changed his whole life. Baker shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the incident. Before he could respond, Chief Washington appeared in the doorway. It's time, Officer Thompson. The department's main conference room was packed. Officers from every shift had been called in, along with administrative staff and even some community representatives. Thompson recognized Robert from the bakery and Anthony from the youth center sitting near the back. Chief Washington had insisted on their presence, stating that transparency was crucial for real change. Taking a deep breath, Thompson began. 3 weeks ago, I had what I thought was the worst day of my career. You've all seen the video, me, disrespecting our new chief because of my own biases. He clicked to the first slide, showing the viral video still. But that day wasn't my worst, it was my wake-up call. Over the next hour, Thompson shared his journey. He showed photos from the community center meetings, statistics on how traffic stops and arrests in his beat had decreased while community cooperation had increased. He played recordings of community members describing their changing perceptions of police presence in their neighborhoods. We've been trained to see threats, Thompson explained, but sometimes we're creating them ourselves. Every time we approach a situation expecting the worst, we're building walls between us and the people we're supposed to protect. He shared stories from the youth center, describing how teenagers who once ran from police cars were now joining community programs. Last week, I helped Chris, a kid I used to view as a potential troublemaker, fill out his college applications. That's not soft policing, that's preventing crime before it happens. In the back of the room, Chief Washington nodded approvingly as Thompson addressed the uncomfortable truths about departmental bias. Some officers shifted in their seats, others took notes, but all were listening. I'm not standing here claiming I'm perfect now, Thompson continued. I'm still learning, still catching myself making assumptions. But here's what I know, when we start seeing people as people, not just potential suspects, everything changes. He clicked to his final slide, showing a recent photo from the youth center basketball game. In it, Thompson was coaching a diverse group of teenagers, all wearing shirts that read, "Community Champions." This is what real community policing looks like, he said. It's not just about keeping the peace, it's about being part of the community we serve. As Thompson concluded, the room remained silent for a moment. Then Officer Rodriguez, a younger cop, raised his hand. How do you handle the transition? I mean, we still need to be vigilant, right? Absolutely, Thompson replied. But there's a difference between being vigilant and being prejudiced. I've learned that building relationships actually makes us better at identifying real threats because the community starts working with us, not against us. Chief Washington stood up. What Officer Thompson is describing isn't just a feel-good story. Since implementing these community-focused approaches in his beat, we've seen a 30% increase in solved cases due to increased community cooperation. This is effective policing. After the presentation, officers gathered in small groups, discussing what they'd heard. Baker approached Thompson, his earlier skepticism replaced with contemplation. That kid with the scholarship, I remember him. Never thought about how that stop might have affected his future. None of us did, Thompson replied. That's the point. Later that afternoon, Thompson found himself back at the youth center, watching a basketball game. Chief Washington joined him on the bleachers. Your presentation made an impact, the chief said. 3 officers have already requested to join the community outreach program. Thompson watched as Chris made a perfect three-point shot. The teenager caught his eye and grinned, giving him a quick thumbs up. You know, Chief, when you assigned me to community outreach, I thought it was a punishment. But it might be the most important work I've ever done. That's because it is, Chief Washington replied. Building trust, breaking down barriers, showing up for these kids, that's what changes communities. And sometimes, it changes us too. As the game continued, Thompson reflected on his journey. The viral video that had once seemed like a career-ending embarrassment had become the catalyst for real change, not just in him but potentially in the entire department. Each small interaction, each conversation, each basketball game was a step toward building the kind of police force their community deserved. The sound of sneakers squeaking on the court and children's laughter filled the gym, a far cry from the sirens and confrontations that had once defined his days. Thompson realized that while he'd started this journey being forced to face his biases, he was continuing it because he truly believed in the change it was creating. 2 months after Thompson's presentation, the changes in Riverside were becoming visible. The morning sun illuminated the newly painted mural on the side of the youth center, a collaborative project between local artists and police officers, depicting hands of different colors joined together. Thompson pulled up in his patrol car, now a welcome sight in the neighborhood rather than a source of tension. Inside the youth center, a new program was taking shape. Officer Rodriguez, inspired by Thompson's presentation, had started a coding workshop, teaching teenagers the basics of computer programming. The room that once held wary interactions between youth and police now buzzed with conversations about algorithms and app development. Officer T. Chris called out as Thompson entered. check this out." He proudly showed Thompson his college acceptance letter to the state university's architecture program. Thompson felt a surge of pride, remembering their conversations about building designs during basketball practice breaks. "First one in my family to go to college," Chris said quietly. "Remember when you helped me with those applications? Never thought I'd be thanking a cop for anything, but here we are." The moment was interrupted by a call on Thompson's radio. A situation was developing at Robert's Bakery. As Thompson arrived at the scene, he found a tense situation unfolding. A young man had attempted to steal from the register, but instead of immediately calling for backup, Robert had tried something different. "I recognized him from the neighborhood," Robert explained as Thompson entered. "He's been having a rough time since his mother got sick. Instead of pressing charges, I want to offer him a job. But I needed an officer here to make it official, and well, I called you specifically." The young man sat at one of the bakery tables, looking both ashamed and hopeful. Thompson remembered a time when he would have immediately pulled out his handcuffs, focused solely on the law being broken rather than the person who broke it. "Let's talk this through," Thompson said, sitting down at the table. Over the next hour, they worked out an agreement. The young man would work to repay what he attempted to steal, learn a trade, and attend the youth center's counseling program. As Thompson filled out the paperwork for the restorative justice program Chief Washington had recently implemented, his phone buzzed with a message. The local news wanted to do a follow-up story on how the department had changed since the viral video incident. Back at the station, Chief Washington called a meeting to discuss the media request. "They want to showcase our community policing success," he explained to the gathered officers. "Thompson, your beat has become a model for what we're trying to achieve department-wide." Officer Baker, who had been one of the most skeptical of the changes, spoke up. "You know, I've been doing this job for 20 years, thought I knew everything there was to know about policing. But last week, I helped a kid with his homework during my lunch break at the community center. His math scores went up, and suddenly his whole family sees us differently. Never thought that would be part of my job, but maybe that's exactly what the job should be." The chief smiled. "That's exactly the point. Every positive interaction builds trust, and trust makes our entire community safer." Later that afternoon, Thompson attended a neighborhood council meeting. The same woman who had spoken about teaching her son to fear the police now shared a different story. "My boy saw Officer Thompson and Officer Rodriguez playing basketball with the kids at the youth center. He asked me if he could join them. Do you know what that means? My son is seeing police officers as people he can trust, not people he needs to fear." The transformation wasn't just in the community's perception. Thompson noticed changes in his fellow officers too. Traffic stops in minority neighborhoods had decreased, while voluntary community cooperation had increased. Officers were getting out of their cars more, walking the beats, learning names, and becoming part of the fabric of the neighborhood rather than just its enforcers. At the youth center's weekly basketball game, Thompson watched as several officers he'd never expected to participate coached teams of eager teenagers. The gym echoed with laughter and encouragement, the uniforms no longer a barrier but a bridge. "You started something here," Chief Washington said, joining Thompson on the bleachers. "When I first came to Riverside, I saw a department that needed change. But I also saw officers like you, who just needed to see things differently." Thompson thought about the viral video that had started it all. "You know, Chief, when that video went viral, I thought my career was over. Never imagined it would lead to all this." "Sometimes our worst moments become our best teachers," the chief replied. "The real measure isn't in never making mistakes, it's in how we learn from them." As they watched the game, Thompson noticed Robert from the bakery entering the gym with boxes of fresh pastries. The young man who had attempted to rob him was helping, now wearing a bakery apron. They set up the treats for after the game. The former incident transformed into an opportunity for growth and connection. Officer Chen approached with news from her latest community survey. Complaints are down 60% in areas where we've implemented the new approaches, she reported. And here's something interesting, we're getting more applications for the police academy from minority candidates than ever before. Thompson remembered his own journey, how a single incident had cracked open his perspective and led to profound change. Now, that change was rippling out, touching lives in ways he never could have imagined. "You know what the best part is?" he said to Chief Washington. "It's not just about policing anymore. It's about being part of something bigger. Every kid who sees an officer as a mentor instead of a threat, every business owner who sees us as partners instead of just authority figures, that's real community safety." The chief nodded, watching as Chris made a winning shot, celebrated by officers and teenagers alike. "That's exactly what I hoped would happen when I took this job. Real change doesn't come from top-down orders. It comes from officers like you, willing to look in the mirror and then work to be better." As the sun set over Riverside, casting long shadows through the gym windows, Thompson realized that what had started as one officer's wake-up call had grown into something much larger, a template for how police departments everywhere could transform their relationships with their communities, one interaction at a time. 6 months after the viral video incident, the Riverside Police Department hosted its first regional community policing summit. Police chiefs and officers from neighboring cities filled the community center, drawn by reports of Riverside's dramatic transformation. Thompson stood at the podium, still amazed that his story had become a catalyst for broader change. When that video went viral, Thompson began, scanning the crowd of uniforms and community leaders, "I thought it was the end of my career. Instead, it was the beginning of the most important work I've ever done." He glanced at Chief Washington, who sat in the front row, nodding encouragingly. As Thompson shared Riverside's journey, he could see the impact of his words on the visiting officers' faces. Some showed skepticism, the same kind he'd once worn, while others leaned forward, taking notes and nodding in recognition of shared challenges. Last week, Thompson continued, a teenager was caught stealing from a local store. 6 months ago, that would have meant automatic arrest, another young life potentially derailed by one mistake. Instead, the store owner called me directly. Why? Because we'd built a relationship through our community programs. Together, we found a better solution. The teenager now works at the store after school, learning business skills and earning money to help his family. A police chief from a neighboring city raised his hand. "These programs sound great, but what about serious crime? Isn't this soft policing?" Chief Washington stood to address the question. "Since implementing these changes, our serious crime rate has dropped by 25%. When communities trust law enforcement, they share information. They help prevent crimes before they happen. That's not soft policing, that's smart policing." During the lunch break, Thompson walked through the various presentation booths set up around the community center. Officer Rodriguez demonstrated the coding program he'd started, now expanded to 3 locations. Officer Chen showcased the department's new community feedback system, which had become a model for transparent police-community relations. At one booth, Chris, now a freshman architecture student, presented designs for a new youth center building, a collaboration between the police department and the community. "Officer Thompson," he called out, "tell them about how the basketball program changed things." Thompson smiled, remembering those first awkward games that had evolved into a vital community connection. "Sports were just the beginning," he explained to the gathered chiefs. "It gave us a chance to see each other as people first, not just uniforms and stereotypes." Robert from the bakery had catered the event, working alongside the young man who had once tried to rob him. They'd become a powerful example of restorative justice in action, their story featured in a documentary about community policing that was gaining national attention. During the afternoon sessions, Thompson led a workshop on practical steps for implementing community-based policing. Officers from various departments shared their own challenges and fears. A veteran officer from a nearby city spoke up, his voice carrying years of experience and concern. "I've been on the force for 25 years, he said. "I've seen programs come and go. What makes this different?" Thompson understood the skepticism. "The difference is, we're not just changing policies, we're changing hearts and minds, including our own. It starts with admitting our own biases and being willing to learn from the communities we serve." As if to illustrate his point, a group of teenagers from the youth center arrived after school, joining the discussion with a confidence that would have been unthinkable months ago. They shared their perspectives on police interactions, their hopes for the future, and their role in building better community relations. One of the visiting chiefs pulled Chief Washington aside. "I've got to admit, when I saw that viral video, I thought Riverside was headed for trouble. But you've turned it into an opportunity for real change. We need this in our city." Chief Washington smiled. "Start with one officer, one interaction, one changed mind at a time. That's how real transformation happens." Later that evening, as the summit wound down, Thompson found himself in a circle of officers from different departments, sharing stories and strategies. The barriers between departments were breaking down, just as the barriers between police and community had started to crumble in Riverside. "You know what amazes me?" Officer Baker commented, joining the group. "6 months ago, I thought this was all just PR damage control. Now I'm teaching other departments how to set up youth mentorship programs. Never thought I'd see the day." As the visitors began to leave, carrying action plans and new perspectives back to their own departments, Thompson felt a sense of possibility he'd never experienced in his years of traditional policing. The ripple effects of that confrontation with Chief Washington were spreading far beyond Riverside's borders. Chief Washington gathered his team for a final debrief. "What happened here isn't just about one department or one city," he said. "It's about reimagining what policing can be. Each of you has played a part in that transformation." Thompson stayed late, helping to clean up the community center. Chris and some other youth center regulars pitched in, the interaction so natural now that no one remarked on the significance of teens and officers working side by side. "My little brother wants to be a police officer now," Chris mentioned casually, stacking chairs. "Never thought I'd be okay with that, but if he can be the kind of officer you've become, I'd be proud." Those words hit Thompson hard. He remembered his own journey from confrontation to transformation, from bias to understanding. As he looked around the community center, at the mural they'd painted together, the coding class computers, the basketball court where barriers had begun to break down, he saw more than just programs and policies. He saw the future of policing, built on relationships, understanding, and shared humanity. His phone buzzed with messages from officers who'd attended the summit, asking for advice on starting similar programs in their cities. The viral video that had once threatened to end his career had instead sparked a movement, one that was growing beyond anything he could have imagined. 1 year after the viral video incident, Riverside had become a case study in police transformation. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the newly renovated police department community room, where Thompson sat reviewing the department's annual report with Chief Washington. The numbers told a story that even the most hardened skeptics couldn't ignore: crime rates down, community engagement up, and police recruitment from minority communities at an all-time high. "Did you ever think that morning would lead to all this?" Chief Washington asked, gesturing to the wall of photos documenting their year of change. The infamous video still held a place of honor, not as a source of shame, but as a reminder of how transformation often begins with confronting uncomfortable truths. "Never," Thompson admitted, studying a recent photo of the youth center graduation ceremony. "I was so focused on authority, I'd forgotten about humanity." He paused, remembering countless faces and moments from the past year. "You could have fired me that day." The chief smiled. "Sometimes the best teachers are our own mistakes, if we're willing to learn from them." Their conversation was interrupted by excited voices from the lobby. Chris burst in, followed by a group of teenagers from the youth center's leadership program. "Officer Thompson." The plans got approved. The architectural designs Chris had created for the new youth center expansion, his first real project as an architecture student, had been accepted by the city council. What made it special was how it had come together. Police officers and community members had worked side by side with Chris, providing input and support throughout the process. "We're breaking ground next month," Chris announced proudly. "And guess what? 2 other cities want to use the same design for their community centers. They're calling it the Riverside Model." Thompson remembered the angry, distrustful teenager he'd once profiled as a troublemaker. Now here was Chris, speaking confidently about his designs being adopted across the state. It was just one of countless transformations he'd witnessed over the past year. The viral video that had once threatened to end his career had instead sparked a movement, one that was growing beyond anything he could have imagined. 1 year after the viral video incident, Riverside had become a case study in police transformation. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the newly renovated police department community room, where Thompson sat reviewing the department's annual report with Chief Washington. The numbers told a story that even the most hardened skeptics couldn't ignore: crime rates down, community engagement up, and police recruitment from minority communities at an all-time high. "Did you ever think that morning would lead to all this?" Chief Washington asked, gesturing to the wall of photos documenting their year of change. The infamous video still held a place of honor, not as a source of shame, but as a reminder of how transformation often begins with confronting uncomfortable truths. "Never," Thompson admitted, studying a recent photo of the youth center graduation ceremony. "I was so focused on authority, I'd forgotten about humanity." He paused, remembering countless faces and moments from the past year. "You could have fired me that day." The chief smiled. "Sometimes the best teachers are our own mistakes, if we're willing to learn from them." Their conversation was interrupted by excited voices from the lobby. Chris burst in, followed by a group of teenagers from the youth center's leadership program. "Officer Thompson. The plans got approved." The architectural designs Chris had created for the new youth center expansion, his first real project as an architecture student, had been accepted by the city council. What made it special was how it had come together. Police officers and community members had worked side by side with Chris, providing input and support throughout the process. "We're breaking ground next month," Chris announced proudly. "And guess what? 2 other cities want to use the same design for their community centers. They're calling it the Riverside Model." Thompson remembered the angry, distrustful teenager he'd once profiled as a troublemaker. Now here was Chris, speaking confidently about his designs being adopted across the state. It was just one of countless transformations he'd witnessed over the past year. Later that afternoon, Thompson attended a graduation ceremony at Robert's Bakery. The young man who had once attempted robbery was completing his apprenticeship program. The bakery had become a model for business-police partnership, with Robert regularly speaking at community meetings about the power of second chances and restorative justice. "Your story inspired me," Robert told Thompson as they watched the celebration. "If you could change, if we could all change, then maybe everything else could too." The ceremony was interrupted by a call, a situation developing at a local high school. Thompson and Officer Rodriguez responded, but this time everything was different. Instead of rushing in with sirens blaring, they were greeted by the school's peer mediators, students trained through one of their new community programs. 2 freshmen got into an argument, a student mediator explained professionally. "We've got them in separate rooms, using the de-escalation techniques Officer Rodriguez taught us. We just need you here to make it official." What could have become a typical school-to-prison pipeline incident was instead transformed into a learning opportunity. The 2 students, with support from their peers and officers, worked through their conflict and even joined the peer mediation program themselves. Back at the station, Thompson found Officer Baker preparing for his first presentation to a national police conference. "If you'd told me a year ago I'd be teaching other departments about community engagement, I'd have laughed you out of the room," Baker admitted. But these kids, these programs, they're changing everything. The day's biggest event was the evening's community town hall. The community center was packed with residents, officers, and visitors from other cities. The mood was different from those tense early meetings. There was laughter, casual conversation between officers and residents, and a sense of shared purpose. Chief Washington took the podium. 1 year ago, a video went viral showing what needed to change in our department. Today, we're creating new videos, of officers mentoring youth, of community programs making real differences, of what policing can be when we work together. Thompson watched as various community members shared their stories. The mother who had once taught her son to fear police now led a parent-officer dialogue program. Local business owners spoke about decreased crime and increased cooperation. Teenagers proudly presented data from their coding program, showing how technology could bridge gaps between police and youth.